Imagine a billionaire, standing on the edge of a bridge, his fingers slipping, his life hanging by a thread. The city lights shimmer below, but no one is there to save him. His money, his power, none of it matters now. Just as he's about to fall, a figure steps forward. But it's not a bodyguard, not a wealthy friend. It's a 14-year-old homeless boy, a kid who has nothing, not even a place to sleep. And yet, in this moment, he makes a choice that will change both of their lives forever. Why would someone with nothing risk it all for a man who has everything? And what happens after the rescue will shock you even more. This isn't just a story about life and death. It's a lesson in humanity you'll never forget. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about wealth, kindness, and fate. Welcome to the channel. Today, I have a story that will leave you questioning everything about wealth, kindness, and the true measure of a person. A billionaire, clinging for his life on the edge of a bridge, moments from falling to his death. No security, no friends, just silence. And then, out of nowhere, a 14-year-old homeless boy appears. A kid with no money, no home, no future. And yet, in that moment, he makes a decision that will change both their lives forever. Why would someone with nothing risk it all for a man who has everything? And what happens after the rescue is even more unbelievable. Stay till the end, because this story will completely change the way you see the world. The night was cold, the wind howling through the empty streets. The city was alive with lights and movement, but on one particular bridge, high above the rushing waters, a man hung desperately onto the railing, his hands slipping with each passing second. This was no ordinary man. He was Alexander Grayson, a billionaire known for his ruthless business empire. He had everything: mansions, cars, power. But at this moment, none of it mattered. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared down at the dark abyss below. He had climbed over the railing, thinking he was making a final decision. But now, as he clung to the icy metal, survival instincts kicked in. He didn't want to die, but his body was giving out, and there was no one around to help him. Or so he thought. A few feet away, a 14-year-old boy named Jake wandered the streets, his stomach empty, his body trembling from the cold. Jake had been homeless for nearly a year, ever since his mother passed away and his father abandoned him. The city was a cruel place for a kid like him. People walked past him every day, ignoring his pleas for food, pretending he didn't exist. But Jake wasn't bitter. He had learned to survive, to push forward even when the world seemed determined to break him. That night, Jake had no idea his life was about to change forever. As he walked along the bridge, looking for a sheltered place to sleep, he heard something, a sound that didn't belong. A sharp gasp, a desperate struggle. He turned his head and saw the man hanging onto the railing, his expensive suit torn, his fingers slipping. Their eyes met for a brief second. The billionaire's eyes were filled with fear, pleading for help without a single word spoken. Jake could have walked away. It wasn't his problem. The world had never shown him kindness. Why should he risk his life for a stranger? And not just any stranger. A man who probably had the power to change lives, but had never spared a thought for people like him. The irony was almost laughable. But Jake didn't laugh. Something inside him refused to turn away. Maybe it was the way the man's eyes reminded him of his own, filled with pain, regret, and a silent cry for help. He ran to the railing. "Hold on," he shouted, gripping the man's wrist. The billionaire's hand was ice cold, his strength fading fast. Jake planted his feet firmly, using every ounce of strength he had. "I won't let go," he said, his voice determined. But in truth, he wasn't sure if he had the strength to pull a grown man back to safety. Alexander, breathing heavily, stared at the boy in shock. Of all the people in the world, it was a homeless kid trying to save him. His mind raced. Why? Why would a child, who had nothing, risk his own life for him? Guilt washed over him. Had he ever done anything to help kids like this? He couldn't remember. Right now, none of that mattered. He wanted to live. Jake tightened his grip, his muscles burning. "I need you to help me," he yelled. "Pull yourself up." But Alexander's body was heavy, and his energy was nearly gone. The wind whipped around them, making it even harder. Jake knew he had only seconds before the man slipped for good. He had to act fast. Taking a deep breath, Jake repositioned himself, planting one foot against the railing for better leverage. He pulled with everything he had. The billionaire groaned, using whatever strength remained to push himself upward. Inch by inch, they fought against gravity, against fate itself. The boy, who had nothing, was carrying the weight of a man who had everything. And then, with one final pull, Alexander tumbled forward, crashing onto the pavement, gasping for air. Jake fell back, exhausted. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just lay there, breathing, the reality of what just happened sinking in. The billionaire turned his head, looking at the boy beside him. He wasn't just alive. He had been saved by someone society had forgotten. And that realization hit him harder than anything else ever had. Alexander lay on the cold pavement, his breath ragged, his body trembling from the shock of what had just happened. He had been seconds away from death, and the only reason he was still alive was because of a boy who had nothing to his name, yet had chosen to risk everything to save him. The billionaire turned his head, staring at the 14-year-old beside him. Jake was equally exhausted, his small frame rising and falling as he gasped for air. His clothes were worn, his hands dirty, but his eyes held something that Alexander hadn't seen in a long time, pure determination. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city hummed in the background, distant and unimportant. Finally, Alexander found his voice, though it was weak. Why did you help me? His mind couldn't wrap around it. He had spent his entire life surrounded by powerful, wealthy people who would only lift a finger if there was something in it for them. Yet here was a kid who had every reason to turn away, choosing to save him instead. Jake sat up, stretching his aching arms. "Because you needed help," he said simply. There was no hesitation, no ulterior motive in his voice. Just honesty. He wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve and looked at Alexander. "You didn't want to die, right?" Alexander blinked. He had climbed over that railing with full intent to end everything. But when he was hanging there, staring into the abyss, fear had gripped him in a way he hadn't expected. And now, sitting here, alive, he realized just how much he wanted to live. He swallowed hard and nodded. "No, I didn't." Jake nodded back as if that was all the explanation he needed. He pushed himself up and dusted off his ragged hoodie. "Then you're lucky I was passing by." His tone wasn't boastful or proud. It was just a fact. He had done what he felt was right, and now, in his mind, it was time to move on. But Alexander wasn't ready to let him go just yet. He sat up, ignoring the way his body ached. "Wait," he said, his voice firmer now. "Who are you?" Jake hesitated, then shrugged. "Just Jake." "Just Jake?" Alexander repeated. The name meant nothing to him, yet in this moment, it carried more weight than any name he had ever encountered in his high society world. "Where do you live?" Jake laughed dryly. "Nowhere." He gestured to the city around them. "Wherever I can find a place to sleep, I guess." Alexander's stomach twisted. He had built an empire, had more wealth than most people could ever dream of. Yet he had never truly seen the world from this perspective. He had driven past homeless people before, read reports about poverty, even donated to charities without a second thought. But never, not once, had he spoken to someone who lived it. And now, the very person who had saved his life was one of those people, the kind he had ignored. Something inside him shifted. Jake sighed and stretched his arms. "Well, you're okay now, so I should go." He turned, ready to walk away. This was nothing new for him. He had helped someone, and now it was time to disappear again. That was the way the world worked, right? People didn't really care about kids like him. But before he could take a step, Alexander's voice stopped him. "Wait." Jake paused, turning his head slightly. "Where will you go?" Alexander asked, surprising even himself with how much he wanted to know the answer. Jake shrugged. "Does it matter?" It did. For the first time in a long time, Alexander felt something he couldn't quite describe. An obligation, responsibility, maybe even guilt. This boy had saved his life, and now he was just going to let him walk away into the night? Back to sleeping on park benches, struggling to survive? It didn't sit right. Come with me, Alexander said suddenly. Jake froze. He turned fully now, raising an eyebrow. What? Come with me, Alexander repeated. He wasn't entirely sure what he was offering. Shelter for the night? A meal? Something more? But he knew he couldn't just let this kid disappear into the darkness after what had happened. Jake studied him carefully. He had been on the streets long enough to know that people didn't offer kindness without expecting something in return. Why? He asked cautiously. Alexander exhaled, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Because you saved my life, he admitted. And I think it's time someone did something for you. For the first time, Jake didn't have a quick response. He just stood there, looking at the man he had just pulled back from the brink of death. A man who, by all logic, should have never noticed a kid like him. And yet, here they were. Two people from opposite worlds, bound together by a single moment of fate. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. Jake hesitated, his mind racing. He had learned the hard way not to trust people, especially rich ones. The world had taught him that wealth made people selfish, blind to those who struggled just to survive. And yet, here was a billionaire, offering him something. A way out? A trick? He wasn't sure. But something in Alexander's voice told him this was different. There was no arrogance, no pity, just an honest offer. You serious? Jake finally asked, narrowing his eyes. Alexander nodded. Yes. I don't know what I can do for you yet, but I can't just let you walk away. Jake shifted on his feet. He didn't like owing people. Life on the streets had taught him that every favor came with a price. But then again, what did he have to lose? If this guy tried anything, Jake knew how to disappear. He had done it plenty of times before. All right, Jake said slowly. One meal. That's it. Alexander gave a small smile, a mix of relief and something else, maybe gratitude. One meal, he agreed. They left the bridge, walking in silence toward Alexander's car, a sleek, black luxury vehicle parked near the edge of the street. Jake eyed it with skepticism. Figures, he muttered under his breath. Alexander opened the door and gestured for Jake to get in. You ever been in one of these before? Jake scoffed. You think homeless kids get to ride in fancy cars? He hesitated for just a second before climbing in. The seats were softer than anything he had felt in years. It felt safe. That was an unfamiliar feeling. As Alexander pulled onto the road, Jake kept his hands in his lap, unsure of what to say. He had been alone for so long that normal conversation felt strange. But Alexander was just as lost in thought. He had spent his life making business deals, negotiating billion-dollar contracts, but he had no idea how to talk to a 14-year-old who had been living on the streets. After a long silence, Alexander finally spoke. How long have you been homeless? Jake tensed. Why does it matter? It matters, Alexander said gently. I want to understand. Jake studied him. Most people asked out of curiosity or pity. This felt different. He sighed and looked out the window. Since I was 13, my mom got sick, and we lost everything. When she died, my dad couldn't handle it. He left, never came back. His voice was flat, like he had told the story too many times to care anymore. Alexander gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. He had built an empire, made money in ways most people couldn't even imagine, yet he had never stopped to consider how easily life could fall apart for someone else. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Jake shrugged. Yeah, well, it is what it is. The car pulled up to a high-end restaurant, and Jake instantly felt out of place. The bright lights, the expensive decor. This was a world he didn't belong in. As they walked inside, people turned to stare. A man like Alexander in a place like this was normal, but a kid like Jake? He could feel the judgment in their eyes. The hostess looked at Jake's worn-out hoodie and ragged jeans before forcing a smile. Sir, are you sure? Table for two, Alexander interrupted, his voice firm. His expression left no room for argument. The hostess nodded quickly and led them to a private booth. As they sat down, Jake leaned in. People are looking at me like I don't belong. They're looking at you because they don't understand, Alexander replied. They think money defines worth. He paused. I used to think that too. Jake frowned. And now? Now I know I was wrong. The waiter arrived, and Jake hesitated, scanning the menu. The prices made his head spin. $40 for a burger, he whispered. I could eat for a week with that. Alexander smirked. Tonight, don't worry about money. Order whatever you want. Jake bit his lip. He had never been given that kind of freedom before. After a moment, he ordered the biggest meal he could find, half expecting someone to stop him. But Alexander just nodded, as if it was completely normal. As the food arrived, Jake ate like he hadn't seen a meal in days, because he hadn't. Alexander watched, something stirring inside him. This wasn't charity. This was the first time he had truly seen someone outside his world of wealth and power. After a while, Jake finally slowed down, leaning back in his seat. All right, he said. You fed me. Now what? Alexander exhaled. I don't know, he admitted. But I do know this. I don't think you should be out there alone anymore. Jake raised an eyebrow. And what? You think you can just fix my life? His voice wasn't angry, just tired. Rich guys like you don't get it. You can't just throw money at a problem and make it go away. Alexander leaned forward. You're right. Money isn't the answer to everything. But opportunity? That's different. No one gave you a chance, Jake. Maybe it's time someone did. Jake didn't respond right away. He had heard empty promises before. But something about this felt different. He wasn't sure if he trusted it yet. But for the first time in a long time, he was willing to consider the possibility. Jake leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, studying Alexander carefully. He had spent the last year surviving in a world that ignored kids like him. The idea that a billionaire, someone who had everything, suddenly wanted to help him, it didn't make sense. People didn't just change overnight. You really think you can just help me? Jake asked, skepticism lacing his voice. Alexander didn't flinch. I don't know if I can, he admitted, but I know I want to. Jake scoffed. Why? Because you feel guilty? Alexander exhaled, rubbing his temples. At first? Maybe. But that's not why I'm still sitting here, talking to you. He looked Jake straight in the eyes. You saved my life. You didn't have to. And now, I can't just let you walk away like none of this happened. Jake wanted to argue, to tell Alexander that he wasn't some charity case, that rich people couldn't just throw kindness at someone and expect to fix years of struggle. But the truth was, he was exhausted, tired of running, tired of waking up hungry, tired of pretending he didn't care. And for the first time in forever, someone was offering him something. But was it real? Jake leaned forward, lowering his voice. Let me tell you how this usually goes. Someone takes pity on me, gives me a meal, maybe a few bucks, then they walk away feeling good about themselves. But nothing changes. I go back to sleeping under bridges, stealing food if I have to. That's reality. So unless you're planning to actually do something, I'd rather not waste my time. Alexander's jaw tightened. I don't want to be another person who walks away. Then prove it, Jake shot back. Because talk is cheap. Alexander fell silent. Jake expected him to back down, to hesitate, to realize that this was more than just a one-time act of kindness. But instead, Alexander reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and made a call. James, he said, speaking to someone on the other end, I need you to clear my schedule for tomorrow. Something more important has come up. Jake's eyes widened. Who's James? My assistant, Alexander replied. He runs my life, basically. Jake shook his head. You really just canceled everything for this? For me. Alexander placed his phone down and met Jake's gaze. Yes. Because you're right, if I walk away now, I'm no different than the people who ignored you. Jake didn't know how to respond. His instinct told him not to trust it. People let you down. That was just how the world worked. But what if, just this once, it didn't? You got somewhere to stay tonight? Alexander asked. Jake hesitated, then shook his head. Then you're coming with me, Alexander said firmly. I have a guest room. No strings attached, no obligations. Just a safe place to sleep. Jake's first instinct was to say no. He had never relied on anyone before, and he wasn't about to start now. But deep down, a part of him wanted to say yes. to just let himself rest, to not have to keep running, just for one night. All right, Jake finally muttered. One night. Alexander nodded. One night. But both of them knew this was just the beginning. The drive to Alexander's penthouse was quiet. Jake stared out the window, watching the city blur past. The same city that had ignored him, that had treated him like he was invisible. And yet, tonight, everything felt different. When they arrived, the sheer size of the place stunned Jake. Marble floors, high ceilings, a view that stretched across the skyline. It was more space than he had ever seen in his life. "Welcome home," Alexander said. Jake frowned. "This isn't my home." Alexander sighed. "No, but maybe it could be." Jake wanted to laugh, to dismiss it, to tell himself this was temporary. But deep down, something whispered that this night might change everything. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. What started as a moment of desperation on the edge of a bridge turned into something neither of them could have predicted. A billionaire, who once thought money was the answer to everything, was saved by a boy who had nothing. And that boy, who had spent years being ignored by the world, was finally seen. Jake didn't trust easily, and Alexander knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. But that night was the first step. One meal, one conversation, one chance at something more. Alexander had spent his life surrounded by people who only cared about power and wealth, but it took a 14-year-old homeless kid to teach him the true value of a life. And for Jake, who had spent so long believing he was alone, this was the first time someone had chosen him. Not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because, for the first time, someone believed he deserved a better life. This story isn't just about survival. It's about the choices we make, the people we choose to help, and how a single moment of kindness can change everything. So, what would you have done? If you had nothing, would you still help someone who had everything? Let me know in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming soon. Stories that remind us of the power of humanity, no matter where we come from. This is Mr. Robert's story, and I'll see you in the next one.